Hello, I'm Kate Thomas, and this is At Home Radio, about feeling at home where we are, whether it's with ourselves or out in the world. When we're happy and at ease with our own selves, we have more capacity for kindness and understanding toward others. My guest today is Rene DeBenedictis, Emmy-nominated screenwriter and producer and the author of Short Skirts and Shorter Stories, Musings on Life, Love, and Lust. Great title, Lisa.
Thank you.
This book, your book, Lisa, which came out in December 2015 and is still quite relevant today, is your debut collection of sometimes humorous, deeply moving stories and poems sourced from your extraordinary life. And first, I'd just like you to tell us a little about your life and how you rose to rarefied heights in the competitive television industry.
I was born and raised in Northeastern Ohio, as are most television comedy writers in my experience. There's a plethora of us. And I really believe some of that has to do with the erudite aspect of this area. I think partially because the weather sucks and the library systems are extraordinary. It makes people a little more apt to read. In California, you can surf, 360 days out of the year, but, you're driven inside. So I think that people from this area have a tendency to be more avid readers and so more erudite writers.
Okay. So is that the biggest influence that Northeast Ohio had on your storytelling?
Well, there's a couple of things about Northeast Ohio. I think that there's a, pull yourself up from your bootstraps, drive here where you're, it's instilled when you're little that you're supposed to cut down your own tree and use it as your house and your boat and your coffin, But I do believe that, the weather, drives you toward comedy because, if you're not crying, you're laughing, right? But honestly, I think that people from this area have comedic skills or a comedic bent or a comedic view is kind of necessary to get through the cloudiness and the disparities of winter. And also, in my experience, like I said, that the libraries always, Summit County and Cuyahoga libraries are always rated like first in the country every year. But also, I think the public schools are good here. In my experience, they were good. And I think there's in my life, I came back and raised my children here, and they will tell me that, I was a bad mother for doing so. But I believe that there's a work ethic that's kind of drilled into the environment here, that you're supposed to work hard and play hard. And I like this place. It's home. And probably one of the reasons that I really like it is because I spent so much time other places. So I have other things to compare it to. But sure. I love the public parks here, the libraries, the art museums are extraordinary. I mean, the Cleveland Museum of Art is on par with like the Louvre and the Met, but also like Youngstown has an extraordinary art museum for, only curate American artists. The orchestra is the best in the world. I mean, and there's just a drive here, I think, to succeed. That's my experience anyway.
Well, you spent some time in New York City. You went there even before your career began, you went there without a job and ended up on the team that created the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. How did that happen?
I had won a fellowship. I wrote a piece that was lauded by the International Radio and Television Society. And they had us come. I was one of the only people that was invited that wasn't from an Ivy League college, which was intimidating. I went to the University of Akron. I graduated. It skipped me a couple of years. So I graduated when I just learned how to drive. Um, but a professor.
Were you 16?
Yeah, when I started college.
Whoa.
So my a professor, his name's Dr. Ditzel. He's deceased for decades now, but he encouraged me to apply for this fellowship, and I won, lo and behold. And they flew us first class up to Long Island for this convention. And it was really intimidating. I mean, we were interviewed by like the London Times, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and we had to give these speeches. I remember mine was about how cell phone industry was going to change the world. And, you know, at that point, cell phones were the size of shoe boxes, you know. But, you know, someday everybody would have one, you know. And we got to meet people like Sumner Redstone, I read, died either late last night or this morning. He was one of the first people in the industry that I met. He ended up, you know, becoming the CEO of Viacom, which, and Bob Pittman was an early mentor. He was there, and he had created Nickelodeon, MTV, VH1.
Wow.
So, you know, we were in with these select people. You know, I interviewed 3 people for the paper. And one of them was Bob Pittman, and one of them was Ted Turner, and one of them was David Bianculli, who started in the Miami Herald, if memory serves. He's now on Terry Gross's show, Fresh Air. But at that point, he worked at the Akron Beacon Journal, and I couldn't afford cable as a college student. But the thesis of the entry was how the cable industry was going to change broadcast television. And so I called up David Bianculli to get a quote. And he didn't call me back. So I called him up a week later and happened to get him on the phone. I think I called the arts editor, and that's how I actually got him on the phone. And he said, I don't have time to help college students. I've got deadlines. And I said, really? Because Ted Turner just gave me 40 minutes and Bob Pittman gave me 20 minutes. And so his like quote became the thesis for the paper. And lo and behold, I won that. And so it was 25 of us. And they were supposed to narrow it down to 12 of us to go on and get internships that summer. It was in like February. And then, you know, in end of May, beginning of June, you were supposed to get an internship if you survived the cut. And supposedly they told my professor that I survived the cut, but my roommate lied and said I was bulimic, so she would get the gig instead of me. And I'm not bulimic. And it was just it's something she created. So she was very competitive. And ironically, I ended up like getting a bunch of business cards. And one of the people I got a business card from was a man named Jonathan Sulkin. And he made the mistake, I think he was just being pleasant, to say that, you know, if you ever come to New York, look me up and I'll give you a job. So I literally did that. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame started in what I believe is now Anderson Cooper's private home. It was an old refurbished fire station in Murray Hill, which we actually slid down the pole and stuff. And I rang the bell. I moved there having $250 in my pocket. I'd never been to New York before, other than that Long Island experience. I'd never been to Manhattan. So my mom packed up her Toyota Tercel and drove me there and left me. I had a sublet on Avenue C between 9th and 10th, which at that point, I think it's, you know, an okay neighborhood now, but at that point it was like the heroin district of the world or something. It was a really not safe neighborhood. Cops and cabs did not go beyond A, and I lived on C. And I figured out how to take a subway to the address on the card. And I got up on the Monday after a 4th of July weekend. Maybe it was a Tuesday, I don't recall. And I got my subway ticket and I got to Murray Hill and I asked for Jonathan Sulkin. I said, you told me if I ever, you know, came here that you'd give me a job. And he said, well, I don't know about that. And then I said, well, how about breakfast? I haven't eaten, I'm hungry. And by the end of the breakfast, I got a job. So John D. Whitus was one of the people that I worked with there. She's written about in the book. And from there, she got a gig working on a sitcom. There were 2 sitcoms that were filmed in New York at the time. One was Kate and Allie, and one was The Cosby Show. And so she got me a gig on Kate and Allie. Sherry Coben created that show with Susan St. James and Jane Curtin. And that was my first television job. I really, when I first went there, I wanted to make documentaries, and I had always wanted to be a foreign war correspondent, but somehow or other I became a sitcom writer. They're so unrelated, It's funny.
Well,
I think
you did very well.
Gallows humor both ways, right?
That's great. Well, that story is in your book, along with many, many others. And I mentioned a little earlier that there's a lot of relevance that some of your stories have for today. And one of them, Just an Ounce, which is about isolation, is very relevant to these times during the pandemic when many people feel very alone. And I just wondered why you wrote it a number of years ago.
In some weird way, like New York can be a very isolating place, even though you're always around hundreds of people, I mean, and that's a different kind of loneliness than people are now isolated in their, their own little cave or their own little home. But I think loneliness is an American epidemic in some ways. I was really lonely when my husband and I moved to Los Angeles because eventually I met a lot of people in New York and they became my core group of friends. To this day, they're still like, no matter where we live all over the world, we're still really tight. Because you do run into people like literally in New York, but in LA, you're always in your car and you're always like rushing, during rush hour, taking an hour and a half to get to your commute, and I found that more isolating. But I do believe that one of the reasons I wanted to raise my children here is that I grew up knowing my neighbors and like running around until, dusk and that kind of thing. And that still happens in my little hometown neighborhood. I moved back into my parents' home to take care of them. My father passed away in October. I'm Italian, and it's kind of drilled, into you that you're supposed to write a script, walk across the street, nurse a baby, and take care of elderly parents all at the same time, and cook.
And you do. You're very giving. You're one of the kindest, most generous people I've ever met.
That's really nice because I feel that way about you. So that's really high praise. Thank you. But I do think that people are lonely. I really extend myself to people because I think, that's the way that the world should work, is you're supposed to be connected. And the whole computer thing is good on one hand. I mean, we used to have to go to the library and look things up, encyclopedias, but on the other side of things, it does make people, I think, a little bit lonely. If you're just sitting around reading your computer all day and you're not like out and meeting people or helping other people. I'm again, that whole Italian thing is really, a birthright, I suppose. But, I grew up believing that, you should be around like extended family and grandparents and that kind of stuff. And I worshipped my grandparents and my aunties and uncles and cousins. I liked that whole, there's still to this day, even though my mom and I live in this house now and Dashiell's with us when he's not at school.
Your son?
He's 22. He's a really talented musician. There's always like for dinner, always 5 or 6 or 10 people show up, So I like that. I like, having a hubbub around me. I loved that about having children, and I liked that about like the way I was raised is, on any summer night, my mom would make dinner for who knew how many, and we'd be playing dominoes and eating ice cream and catching fireflies until, midnight.
Yeah, that's wonderful memories. Another relevant story to these times is titled Irrepressible Resilience and Hope, in which you reflect on a tough year that you had. It included a very contentious divorce, flare-ups of multiple sclerosis, and recovery from having fractured your pelvis after a fall. In the story, you talk about a wonderful day when you and a 12-year-old neighbor went on a ride along a new bike path. So would you please read an excerpt from that story?
Sure, I have to find the page here. I just want to interject. The reason I wrote this, screenwriting is a very different discipline to, writing, solitary, a book or that kind of thing. But I was in the hospital. I was in the Cleveland Clinic, which I think is just an extraordinary place. I mean, anytime I can speak publicly about my experience with the clinic, it's been such a positive influence. Um, Both my parents have been very ill as elderly patients, and I was in the hospital like pretty chronically with my dad through really just horrible things like a subdural hematoma after a fall and heart issues, just multiple problems. And so that's why I ended up writing the book, because I was just sitting around, with in a chair. So that's how I ended up writing. And I loved short stories growing up. Like Geoffrey Chaucer was my favorite author at 11. I had read all of the Canterbury Tales.
I
So
like the bites that you have in there. Some of the stories are a little longer, but not really, really long. And other ones are, or maybe a paragraph. And I like that. I like that variety.
I think one of the things about the internet and texting and that kind of thing is it's made our attention spans a little shorter. So, but I like short stories and, poems and musings personally, and that's why I ended up writing it. Irrepressible resilience and hope. A year ago, I had to walk with a walker as a result of a fractured pelvis from a fall. Tonight, my 12-year-old neighbor, Matthew, accompanied me on the newly built bike path. This year's bountiful rain has kept the trees a brilliant green. The night was warm and the harvest moon was full and provided more light than we really needed. We laughed hard as we raced along the path. Sure, we swallowed a couple of gnats along the way. People waved and shouted hi. This year has held so many challenges and such delight. There are so many good and decent people in our country. I have to believe that kindness and laughter count. We all need to pull together and take care of each other and the earth. Trust and hope are much more powerful than bullies. Love and compassion more forceful than hatred and ignorance. It's interesting. It's very relevant for right now in the time of COVID, isn't it?
It really is. And I just love that story because there is divisiveness so much in right now. We seem to be fighting each other all the time. And I completely agree with you that we need to pull together.
I think creativity and is kind of like democracy, if you'll excuse the reference, the analogy. But I recently, I'm friends with Carrie and Steve Clausen. Carrie's a brilliant writer and critic.
And Akron, the Beacon Journal.
Akron Beacon Journal, yeah. And I adore her children, and they're the nicest, funniest couple. And writers kind of hang together like musicians hang together, I suppose. But they had me over to watch Hamilton. I had taken Dash and my mom for their birthdays to see it at Playhouse Square, but we got to see it along with the rest of the planet on Disney Plus with them. We sat outside on the porch and we were socially distanced and very well behaved with our masks
and all that.
But there is good trouble, and good divisiveness. But I think the forefathers, when they created our country, there was divisiveness, but they also listened to each other and read each other. I mean, even like Aaron Burr and Hamilton, disagreed and on paper and in letters, and that didn't end well, as we know. But I believe that there is divisiveness and kind of ugliness and right now. But I think that's an undercurrent. I think there are more that we have in common. I mean, that sounds real Pollyannish, but I have to believe that to get up in the morning. And as a mother, you have to believe in goodness and like nature and the wonder of sunshine, in order to produce your progeny and raise them and become a grandmother, So yes. I think we'll get through all this and it'll be a part of our messy past, like other times of, divisiveness. I was just talking to my mother about that today. I mean, she was really upset about the COVID and like what college kids are going to do. And it's difficult time for everybody, especially I think elderly people who are all alone. My mother's very lucky to have my son and I here and loving neighbors. And, but I think that, when she was growing up, there was World War II. And when my dad was little, there was the Depression. And every generation has difficulties, and how you forge through it and how you get through it is, like I watched American Experience has always been one of my very favorite television shows.
Mhm.
And I watched a piece a couple of weeks ago about polio. And I had the polio vaccine when I was little, and it wasn't really an issue. My first MS doctor actually was a victim of polio, but we don't remember that it was very much like this. Every summer, people were afraid to let their kids swim, and it was a terrible, terrible, debilitating disease if you survived it.
Yes.
And there was such a rush for the vaccine, and it came out before it was prudent, and then that was an issue that the first vaccines were very dangerous, and some people died from them. But I think every generation has difficulties, and this one is ours.
Sure.
But I believe in the resilience of the American people, and the American people are usually they're good and giving people, and so I think we will get through this stronger. I have to believe that.
Yes. Well, you have another excerpt that we talked about your reading, and you offer that hope to young people. Would you read that? It's that story also.
This one's called A Mother's Plea for Gun Control. I've heard debates about the difference between hate crimes and terrorism. It's all the same. Evil strikes to cast a fear and to silence veracity. I speak to college students. I mentor high school students from all ethnicities, religions, and economic backgrounds. I know so many good-hearted, brilliant young people. I call out to you to pick up your pen and computer to make your voices heard. Our fate is up to you and your peers. You are the future. Your zeal for justice, your quest for tolerance, and your fervor for equality can propel change. Hatred exists because the helpless develop a shell of apathy. We need to arm ourselves with compassion, empathy, and enlightenment, not guns. Use your passion to bring forth change.
Yay.
And vote.
And vote. Absolutely. Well, Short Skirts and Shorter Stories, Musings on Life, Love, and Lust is available on Amazon. And I just ordered, I have the audio book, but I also ordered the paperback, and I just did it. So it's quite available. And I so appreciate, Lisa, your being here. And
I appreciate you having me on. I'm so excited for this adventure for you. I think it's going to be wonderful.
Yes.
And I know I'm going to be in really good company with all sorts of international authors and musicians and people of valor that you're going to interview. I do have to say, though, I think that, reading is so important. And I did the book in the basement on GarageBand as an audio book, and that's available on Google, and it's being sold in, I think, 36 different countries, which is the power of Google and the power of the internet.
Great.
But I like to read, and I think whether you listen to books or you read books, that that's a way for you to take a vacation, or it's a way for you to experience things during this time when we are all locked down. It's a cheap vacation.
It is. And since we can't really go on vacation, we might as well escape in our minds, right?
And it's good for you. I mean, it's exercising your brain, which is just as important as exercising your muscles,
Absolutely. Well, thank you again, Lisa. This has been wonderful, and I so look forward to more conversations with you.
Thank you so much.
Until next time, this is Kate Thomas with At Home Radio. Thanks for listening.